All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church, building community, inspiring growth, creating change. Here in the heart of Kansas City, we come together to create this hour of shared reflection so that we might be renewed in courage for these times and inspired to lives of greater dignity, higher purpose, deeper generosity, and more effective action. If you are new to Unitarian Universalism or to our congregation, we want to get to know you and share part of your journey. If this place is already your spiritual home, welcome once more. We need one another, and it is good to be together again. Because we care for one another's safety, our congregation is gathering online during this long season of coronavirus pandemic. Nevertheless, through the gifts of technology, we continue to celebrate community and connections as we lean into the values of justice, compassion, and reason. Together, we learn the love that has the power to overcome both loneliness in the heart and oppression in the world. Welcome to our service this morning. May the words and music and images that we offer today nourish our best selves, calling forth abundant wisdom and love.
Arise, O souls, all arise.
Good morning, and welcome to this gathering of the All Souls community of Kansas City on the 7th of February 2021. Today, we anticipate the celebration of Darwin Day, the 212th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin on February 12th, the British scientific observer and philosopher who first synthesized and published the principles of evolution through genetic inheritance and natural selection. This radical concept set the seal on a new worldview that arose in Western culture with the scientific and industrial revolutions, finding its authority in reason rather than revelation, and its hope in discoveries yet to come rather than long-held traditions. Darwin's daring theory placed humanity not at the pinnacle of an intentional divine act of creation, but within the unfolding universe of a creative energy governed by orderly laws. This morning, we remember Darwin himself as more than a brilliant mind, but also an aristocrat and family man, devoted to his family, whose early voyage of adventure would be painstakingly unpacked in detailed scientific investigations for the rest of his life. That work would be plagued by his ill health for most of his adult years, and he would publish his conclusions only with reluctance, always anxious that one more set of data or one more careful explanation might make his argument conclusive. The world of intellectual convention responded with both fascination and indignation to his ideas. He was denounced by religious leaders of his own time and down to our day. His personal precision, modesty, and propriety of life made it difficult to attack him, yet he has often been portrayed in cartoons and illustrations as a devil for daring to suggest that human beings are only one of the latest, and not necessarily the last, in a progression of creatures to arise from nature's ceaseless variations. This morning we honor Darwin's work by exploring its implications for better understanding the events of our own day and celebrate his insight, his love of the natural world, and his admirable combination of intellectual humility and courage. Darwin's son would remember him as an affectionate father who enjoyed listening to music, but could only hum one tune accurately from beginning to end. That was the Welsh hymn, Ar Hyd Nos, which Peggy will play for our offertory in a few moments while we consider the needs of our homeless neighbors. Now, I invite you to kindle our chalice lights in honor of all those whose work illuminates the realms of science and nature, from Darwin to the vaccine researchers of our contemporary crisis. May they and we be always ready to move beyond the old guesses and approximations to new insight and information as the ever-expanding human quest for knowledge of our world continues to unfold. Let's share in the chat the several places where the flame of our faith is lighted today, and then we will speak the words of our covenant and sing the lovely celebration of nature, Morning Has Broken. Now let's join together in speaking once again our covenant promises to this community. Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the word. Sweet the rain's new fall, sunlit from heaven, like the first dew fall on the first grass. Praise for the sweetness of the wet garden, sprung in completeness where God's feet pass. Mine is the sunlight, mine is the morning,
Good morning, everybody. I'm Joe Robertson, and for many years I've enjoyed volunteering as a teacher in our All Souls Children's Religious Education classrooms. Today, I've got a story to tell, especially for all you children who are out here watching. I'm going to tell you about a little boy who would grow up to be a fabulous scientist who helped us all understand why the earth is filled with so many wildly different kinds of animals. This little boy was named Charles Darwin. He was born 212 years ago in England, and his family went to a Unitarian church whose values and ways of thinking was very much like our All Souls Unitarian Universalist church here in Kansas City thinks today. One thing we all learn in our All Souls classrooms is that we are the church of the open mind, and that we believe in being curious, asking questions, and thinking, always thinking. Young Charles, during his school years, became fascinated with the world around him, particularly the plants and animals. And when he was 22 years old, he boarded a ship called the Beagle. And he took a worldwide voyage around the world for 5 years, visiting exotic shorelines and islands. And he really began thinking about all the different kinds of animals he saw, and how they all seemed to be perfectly suited for the environments they lived in. Now, each different kind of animal is known as a species, and there are more than 1 million different species, from cats and dogs to insects. Now, the things that Charles was thinking about during that journey would be very controversial and daring. Science was much younger back then, and many of the people in the churches in the world around him had a simple explanation as to why there were so many different animals. And that was that God simply created them to fit in the world that they lived in. But whether or not you believed in God, young Charles Darwin wanted to understand through science how it happened. How spiders came to spin webs, how giraffes got long necks, and how chameleons could change colors. After his sea voyage, Charles became famous for his detailed research and writings on nature. And when he was 50 years old, he published one of the most famous books now ever in history, The Origin of Species. You might know this as the theory of evolution. This theory, led by Charles Darwin, turned upside down the world that we lived in and how people thought about the different kinds of animals in the world. Animals weren't created magically to fit in the world they lived in, but they had changed slowly over millions of years as animals with the skills to fly higher, or to see sharper, or to run faster or hide better, they survived and passed on those skills to their babies year after year after year. Now here's the daring and controversial part. This deep thinking described the same origin for we humans, suggesting that we evolved the same way from an original species. And that was hard to accept for many in the world who believed humans had been especially created just as we are today by God. With curiosity and courage, Charles Darwin helped set the foundation for how we think of natural science, and it opened the doors to better understand all life and the growth of our societies, and how science can help us and all species be healthier and stronger in a changing world. That's what being Unitarian is all about. We love the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and we love and respect the interdependent web of life of which we all are a part. So remember Charles Darwin. Stay curious, keep learning, keep thinking, and you too can change the world.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Griggs, and I have been a member of All Souls for 22 years. A little over 3 years ago, the church was moved by the plight of members of our community who have no resources against hunger and cold, and members stepped up to respond, developing the Hunger Outreach and Warming Center teams. Things have gotten even worse since the pandemic began. In October, the Warming Center team realized it wouldn't be safe to open the church in the pandemic. So we looked for other ways to provide warmth, guided by the requests of the people we are serving.
Thanks to your generosity, we raised $1,541 to obtain 35 safe propane tent heaters, along with refillable propane tanks and fire extinguishers for people to warm themselves in their improvised shelters. Thanks to the amazing commitment and tireless leadership of Mark Gibbons and our wonderful hunger outreach team volunteers, we give this equipment to people surviving on the streets. After at least one person froze to death, public outcry and advocacy has brought Kansas City government around to taking action, which led to the opening of an overnight warming center, recently expanded to Bartle Hall. And the city has indicated that they have more plans to help. Yet there are still many people not reached. We are monitoring the calls for assistance, and All Souls can be a fast and flexible resource to obtain what is needed and get it to where it will help the most. At this time, we're hearing calls for blankets, sleeping bags, hand warmers, and gloves, as well as the propane heaters. And we also need to continue to support the hunger outreach team by dropping off food, helping prepare food, and volunteering to serve. Our offering today will go to help replenish the funds that fuel these efforts. There may be only 6 more weeks of winter, but as today's weather and the forecast for this week shows, there's worse to come than we've had so far. Meanwhile, vulnerable people are still in danger. Our willingness to help them get what they need may save their lives. It also helps them feel worthwhile and valued as fellow human beings, and that matters. Our ambition is to distribute everything we can this season, and next year reassess the needs and what we can best do. My friends, we've come to realize that in this effort, All Souls has found a calling that speaks to who we are as a congregation. We are walking our talk. We are taking action toward building a respectful, caring community and creating change toward a more just and compassionate society. The offering will now be taken and gratefully received.
From Why Sex is Fun by Jared Diamond. The key to understanding human sexuality is to recognize that it is a problem in evolutionary biology. When Darwin identified the phenomenon of biological evolution in his great book On the Origin of Species, most of his evidence was drawn from anatomy. He inferred that most plant and animal structures evolve. That is, they tend to change from generation to generation. He also inferred that the major force behind evolutionary change is natural selection. By that term, Darwin meant that plants and animals vary in their anatomical adaptations, and that certain adaptations enable individuals bearing them to survive and reproduce more successfully than other individuals, and that those particular applications therefore increase in frequency in the population from generation to generation. Later biologists showed that Darwin's reasoning about anatomy also applies to physiology and biochemistry. More recently, evolutionary biologists have shown that animal social systems also evolve and adapt. Social behavior has consequences for survival and reproduction. Zoologists studying animals regularly discover that sexual ornaments serve a dual function: to attract potential mates of the opposite sex and to establish dominance over rivals of the same sex. In that respect, as in many others, we humans still carry the legacy of hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution engraved deeply into our sexuality. Over that legacy, our art, language, and culture have only recently added a veneer.
White Riot by Thomas B. Edsall, New York Times, January 13th, 2021. How important is the frustration among what pollsters call non-college white men at not being able to compete with those higher up on the socioeconomic ladder because of educational disadvantage? How critical is declining value in marriage or mating markets? Does any of that really matter? How toxic is the combination of pessimism and anger that stems from a deterioration in standing and authority? Jennifer Richardson, a professor of psychology at Yale, responds that there is very consistent and compelling evidence to suggest that some of what we have witnessed on January 6th is a reflection of the angst, anger, and refusal to accept an America in which white Christian Americans are losing dominance, be it political, material, and/or cultural. And I use the term dominance here because it is not simply a loss of status, it is a loss of power. A more racially, ethnically, religiously diverse U.S. that is also a democracy requires white Americans to acquiesce to the interests and concerns of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. A key factor working in concert to aggravate the enemy and disgruntlement in many members of Trump's white working class base is their inability to obtain a college education, a limitation that blocks access to higher paying jobs and lowers their supposed value in marriage markets. Dr. Keltner, a professor of psychology at Berkeley, describes the fury and disappointment contributing to the takeover of Congress as consecrated among whites who see their position in the social order on a downward path. He writes, the population of U.S. citizens who've lost the most power in the past 40 years, who aren't competing well to get into college or high-paying jobs, whose marital prospects have dimmed, and who are outraged, are those I believe were most likely to be in on the attack. When pressed to give up power, he added, these types of individuals will resort to violence and to refashioning history to suggest they did not really lose.
Hearts onward, habit, brave intent, hammer the golden day until it lies, a glimmering plate to heap with memory. Salute arriving moments with your eyes. We live, we are elected now by time. Few out of many not yet come to birth, and many dead to use the daylight now, to stand beneath the sun upon the earth. Then break the silence with a voice of praise before we fall asleep, before we die. Press mind and body hard against this world. Open the door that opens toward the sky.
This is Abby, everybody. She wanted to say hi, and this seemed like a good morning to let her do that. I don't think that Charles Darwin would have appreciated the Super Bowl game this afternoon, but those who study the implications of his theory should. Darwin himself was focused on the adaptation of physical characteristics to help an animal species adjust successfully to its environment, such as finches whose beaks changed in response to the most plentiful food sources available on a relatively isolated island. But it did not take other biologists following his lead very long to propose that the kind of behaviors we term instinctive might also be the product of natural selection, especially when those behaviors have to do with the very process of reproductive competition by which those adaptations occur. Today, we know a lot about the stunning variety of reproductive strategies employed by various species in order to amplify their genetic code into future generations. These include techniques to increase mating opportunities, to increase the number of potential offspring or their robustness, and to increase the resources such as food and protection available to help those offspring to thrive once they arrive. All of these efforts involve some trade-offs, and with sexual reproduction involving two progenitors, the interests of one parent may not always be congruent with the interests of the other. It is fairly easy to view this process dispassionately when we are talking about insects and birds. Looking at the ways in which human beings resolve the same kinds of challenges starts to feel a bit personal and close to the realm of value judgments. We are, after all, quite vain about our ability to resist and overcome instinct when its impulses urge us to behavior that contradicts what we like to think of as our higher values. When it comes to our own sexual practices, we want to speak in terms of love, beauty, consent, fidelity, pleasure, responsibility, reason, legacy, care. Yet I want to suggest that we do both our own lives and our collective culture a disservice if we try to kick Darwin and his descendants out of the conversation when it turns to human sex. If what we want is to build social structures and personal ethics that enable us to choose thoughtful values and intentional relationships over genetic drive, then we would be well advised to understand how those instincts may be playing themselves out beneath our civilized veneer, even in the realm of politics. Now, it must first be acknowledged that most creatures exercise no reflective intention at all in their efforts to attract mates and produce and rear young. What I am calling reproductive strategies are behaviors formed by the evolutionary pressures of natural selection. They are almost never reflective choices taken by individuals. Male bowerbirds do not think to themselves that growing a longer tail would make them more attractive to potential mothers for their chicks. Female penguins do not ponder whether collecting more nest rocks is really the sign of a superior possible consort. These preferences are hardwired, as is the basic proposition that maximum reproductive success is the name of the entire game. We humans are the only ones who debate about this matter, but I submit that we also engage in all kinds of unreflective behaviors that, upon examination, resemble reproductive strategies, even when that may be the last outcome on our intentional reasoning minds. The concept of selection operates at two levels where sexual reproduction is concerned. On the more basic level, natural forces favor and select those genes which manifest in healthier organisms that more reliably survive infancy, mate successfully, and offer their own young the best opportunity to repeat that process. But there is also selection in the sense of choosing a particular partner from among potential mates, and the physical characteristics and behavior that make one individual more desirable than another. In species where one or both partners abandon the young to fend for themselves almost immediately, the appearance of strength and health and the ability to exclude rivals may be the most relevant. This Darwin understood. But when one of the reproductive success strategies is to care for the young, however, behaviors that suggest the capacity and willingness for competent parenting may be more important than the mere flaunting of abundant protein. And it is here that evolutionary theory has moved beyond its originator. Both males and females are in competition with others of their gender for the mates that are most likely to provide the largest quantity of offspring with the greatest potential for survival. Physical features like a peacock's extravagant tail serve to demonstrate that the individual has the strength, health, and ability to acquire food that allow it to expend physiological energy on creating something essentially useless. Human beings invest less in such organic demonstrations, but we make up the difference in culture. Instead of colorful feathers, we have Rolex watches, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, or PhD diplomas. Part of that competition also involves displays of aggression with three interlocking purposes: to pursue mating opportunities, to defeat potential rivals, and to protect vulnerable offspring from would-be predators. At the same time, both males and females whose children will depend for survival on the investment of co-parents are assessing potential mates not only for their strength, but also for evidence of their capacity for attachment, which will both ensure their contribution to childcare and help to prevent out-of-pair matings. All these things happen in human sexuality, reproduction, and pair bonding too. We just prefer to give them high-sounding names like commitment, romance, motherhood, virility, and soulmates. These concepts are realities of the socially constructed world in which we live, and they apply in relationships that have no actual organic reproductive potential, as I know from my own experience. But keeping their evolutionary roots in mind might help us to unravel some of the mysterious cultural knots in which we sometimes find ourselves caught up. For instance, I've been meditating on the upcoming anniversary of Darwin's birth in 1809, about the recent riot and invasion of the Capitol last month. Much ink has been spilled about the roots of right-wing anger in a sense of economic depression. But the more we learn about the insurrectionists, the less true it seems that they themselves don't know where their next meal is coming from. As a recent article in The Atlantic observed, they tend to be middle-aged, middle-income, and male, and the majority of them were not affiliated with any identifiable right-wing organization. Rather, their free-floating aggression and anger had been focused by the magnifying lens of Trump's claims about a stolen election, and focused not accidentally on Nancy Pelosi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Kamala Harris, and poor Mike Pence. Chaotic male rage at powerful women always gets my attention, in part because it feels personally threatening, but also because it appears to me as part of the pushback against a seismic shift in global culture that has been unfolding throughout my lifetime, and in which I understand myself to be a participant. It didn't start with my generation. The suffragists got me the vote a century ago now. And that transition is highly unlikely to be over within my lifetime, even if I should live to a very ripe old age. But as long as several centuries may feel relative to our lifespans, it is only an eye blink in evolutionary time. And I wonder to what extent we are up against evolutionary forces when we seek legal and social equality for women. Are we in fact looking to reconsider the reproductive strategy of Homo sapiens? And if so, what are some of the implications and the dangers that we should be aware of? The human cultural artifact of reliable birth control has existed for even less time than women have been voting in this nation, and it profoundly shifts that reproductive equation. A woman who has a choice about incurring conception, a choice about carrying a pregnancy to term, and the economic and social resources to choose to raise a child without a co-parent, has no motivation to enter into or remain in an unsuccessful pair bond. She can select a partner for signals of genetic superiority while not being concerned with the necessity to sustain his ongoing investment in their potential child. In this case, the flashy but undependable male finds more opportunities for connections. His less impressive but more dependable counterpart finds fewer. It seems to me that all of us, myself included, have become much more overtly aware over the past 7 years or so of the historical and continuing structures in American society that serve to privilege those with what we call white skin. And we have seen how deeply threatening it can be when those privileges are challenged. We feel it in ourselves as much as we might wish we didn't. And we observe it in the rhetoric and the behavior of others around us. In my own case, I'm quite certain that while the two things are clearly not the same, I have been helped to understand my white privilege more easily by reflecting on my experience of being on the receiving end of culturally encoded male privilege, and observing how men who were raised with that entitlement as an unreflective reality struggle when it is named and confronted. That sensation of having the rug of taken for granted cultural expectations pulled out from under you is disorienting, even if you understand why it is necessary and endorse it as ultimately a good thing. It appears to me that the feeling of indignation that Donald Trump tapped into, not just since the last election, but throughout his political adventures, has its roots in thwarted expectations of both racial and gender privilege, each reinforcing the other. Both of these are exacerbated by the economic redistributions that have empowered women and communities of color by reclaiming some part of a more nearly fair share of opportunity for their members. Women, in particular, can reasonably aspire to careers of social influence and economic self-sufficiency beyond what was possible even a generation ago, and choose for themselves whether and when to bear children. They do not need to settle for whatever minimally competent partner provider might be available in order to realize their own reproductive intentions. This represents a major turning of the cultural tables, where men not so long ago had absolutely essential social and economic resources to bring to the reproductive project. It is now less obvious what qualities will serve to make their contributions attractive. Considered in this light, Trump's infamous Access Hollywood tape claim of grabbing women at will was a brilliant distillation of what his target audience rejoiced to hear. It did him no damage with those we have come to know as his base, the same cohort who lately stormed the Capitol and in true primate fashion left it marked with their feces. These are not the folks who are stealing a loaf of bread in order to ward off starvation. Those folks exist, more shame to the rest of us, but they don't travel across the country to appear in cosplay military get-ups, showing off expensive weaponry and petulantly offensive flags. That behavior, it seems to me, has more in common with male elks measuring their antlers on a rutting ground than with political conviction or free speech. Darwin and his successors would suggest that this is not an accident of history. When the cultural conventions for pursuing reproductive success are up for grabs, as they are in contemporary American society, instinctual patterns will arise to fill the void. There is a long disquisition about how hidden ovulation and extra-long infancy combine to focus human attention on sex itself as the pursuit rather than offspring, but I will spare you at the moment. If you find this stuff fascinating, as I do, read Jared Diamond. With sexual reproduction, especially in mammals and in primates like ourselves, Competitive displays of aggression are part of that hardwired heritage, which is not to say that we have no choice about it. We are, after all, the culture creators, the sublimators, the meaning makers, the self-examining, reflective reasoners who have together learned to adapt our evolutionary instincts in the service of the world as we would wish it to be. Ponder, for example, this evening's anticipated entertainment. There will be ample displays of virility and aggression, all regulated and coordinated in order to offer stimulating pleasure and produce profit. The Super Bowl is a gaudy example of what Homo sapiens do, creating a cultural vessel to contain our instinctive impulses within the most tolerable ratio of satisfaction to risk. It is hedged about with rules and rituals, traditions and sanctions, costumes, even prescribed foods, as well as public interpreters, so that we can all enjoy the atavistic violence with only a small frisson of genuine danger. I make this observation with no intention of contumely. I'm looking forward to it myself, but that doesn't mean I don't get what's going on. It's more structured, and thus I find it more interesting than watching the elk. Or if that example be thought too trivial or too commercial, then return with me to last Wednesday evening, when the cremated remains of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick were brought to lie in honor overnight at the Rotunda before being interred at Arlington National Cemetery. The entire event unfolded in silence. The polished wooden box carried in procession up the marble steps of the entrance to the Capitol building, where he was mortally wounded almost a month before, along with the flag which had earlier draped his coffin. The two objects placed with reverent precision at the center of the room, witnessed and guarded with a fierce, unspoken energy by his colleagues. No brass bands, no choirs, even the commentary of the news anchors was hushed. The most powerful man in the nation, arguably in the world, came and went in subdued and wordless respect, as did others of high degree. The sorrow too deep and the anger too deep to find release in utterance. But over all that charged silence hung a cloud of questions. What does it mean to die in the service of those you have sworn to protect? What does it mean to owe your life to someone else's courage and sacrifice? What is valor? What makes a man worthy of honor and sorrow and love? What does it mean to prepare a nation and a world for our children and our children's children? These are the kinds of questions and the kinds of moments that invite our humanity to transcend the sheer instinct out of which we arise. We can learn a lot from Darwin about the forces that have created our world and us. That self-awareness is essential to whatever we may hope to achieve as a species, but it is only a beginning. And he himself would have been the first to agree. After that, it's up to us. So let's sing. Friends, the world as it lies before us is filled with both heartbreak and opportunity. We arise into consciousness from the dust of stars to be, for a time, the makers of meaning and the bearers of love. Surrounded as we are by beauty, let us spend this mortal moment on what is noble and true. Press mind and body hard against this earth and open the door that opens toward the sky.
The hours of religion, which like sunshine goes everywhere, its temple space, its shrine the good heart, its creed all truth, its ritual words of love.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. For all these we carry in our minds and hearts, until the time shall come when we will be together again. Thank you for being part of our gathering this morning. We invite you to join us now for informal fellowship and conversation at our Zoom social hour. You can connect through the link that appears on the chat or on the All Souls website homepage. If you reserved a Sunday Plus meal, don't forget to pick it up this afternoon between 2 and 3 o'clock. Also, remember to sign up for the chili cook-off on February 28th and to fill out the congregational survey for our advocacy task force. We hope that you will plan to be with us next week when we celebrate the national UU Side with Love campaign and hear from our association president, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, as well as several talented artists and speakers in our national movement. Until then, please, everybody, take care, stay safe, and be well this week.